Nearly 2 weeks after his death, George Floyd is honored by thousands of people across the United States as Washington, D.C. braces for its biggest ever protest against police brutality. France 24's Kitivan Gorgistani is at the march. We'll speak to her in just a moment. The anger following the killing of George Floyd has spread far beyond the U.S.'s borders. Dozens of protests are held across the globe as people demand an end to racism. And hundreds gather in Beirut to voice their anger at the government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis that is plaguing Lebanon. Thank you for joining us here on France 24. Protests in dozens of cities gripped the United States for a 12th consecutive day after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th. As mourners gathered to pay tribute to Floyd in North Carolina, thousands assembled in Washington, D.C. on what could be the city's largest ever demonstration against police brutality. Our very own Kitivan Gorgistani is at the protest. She joins us live. Kitivan, how is the protest shaping up?
Well, there are tens of thousands of people on the street. That I can definitely confirm. We started out with one group of protesters in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and then with that group, I walked with those protesters all the way to the White House. What you see behind me is I'm situated about a block away from 16th Street. That's the street that goes straight to Lafayette Square and to the White House. Now, the problem with counting the number of protesters in this D.C. march is that it's not one organization leading the protest. There are actually nearly a dozen different groups, a dozen different protests that kicked off from different places. So you had thousands of people at the Lincoln Memorial marching. There are already thousands of people waiting at the White House. There were the same number of people in front of Congress, as well as the Martin Luther King Memorial. So really, there were tens of thousands of people marching through the city all throughout the day. So it's going to be very hard to know exactly how many people, but the atmosphere is absolutely peaceful. People started out in front of the Lincoln Memorial with some prayers, some speeches to the crowd, and as we came to this Black Lives Matter Plaza, the newly named Black Lives Matter Plaza, it turned into a huge block party with several blocks of 16th Street blocked off with dancing, music, chanting, different speeches. So it's really the atmosphere that the protesters wanted. They want to make their messages heard, but they also want to show the unity, and that's what we've seen throughout the day. It's really unity between blacks, whites, Latinos, all people of all ages coming together for this big march. The protesters' hope, of course, was to make it a 1 million person march. We'll have to wait a little bit to find out if that actually turned out to be true.
Kitivan, for the past couple of weeks, we've been hearing, aside from the grief and anger, we've been hearing protesters demand justice and calling for a deep reform of the American justice and police system. Have any politicians, whether on the national or local level, spoken up about how they could actually enact that change?
There have been already some steps taken with politicians, of course, talking about new laws, new bills, but that is going to take a little bit more time. What has been happening, even though protesters feel that these are small steps, they are small steps in the right direction. That's how the police is dealing with these protests right now. And we've seen this throughout the United States. Here in Washington, D.C., the mayor requested from the president of the United States to remove all extraordinary federal law enforcement forces as well as military. Today, throughout these protests, throughout the streets of Washington, D.C., police presence is very limited. They're simply there to block off streets. There haven't been any clashes with the protesters, and they're really not very visible throughout the city. In Seattle, for example, the police department has suspended the use of tear gas on protesters for 30 days as it reviews how it does crowd control. Minnesota has decided to ban chokeholds, something that led to the death of George Floyd. So we're seeing different police departments starting to understand that they need to change something in the way policing is done in the United States, whether it's how they deal with these protests, with these peaceful protests, or whether it's how they deal with African Americans when they arrest them on the streets. And that for protesters, as I said, is a step in the right direction. But all the people I spoke to throughout the day were telling me the same thing. These are good things, but we're not stopping here. This is not going to be enough this time. We have to keep the movement going.
Still a long road ahead. Kitivan Gorgesani in Washington, D.C. Kitivan, thank you very much. As we've seen, those hundreds of people gathering in the U.S.'s capital. But meanwhile, in North Carolina, George Floyd's coffin arrived in that state earlier this Saturday. Floyd was born in Fayetteville in 1973. A memorial is currently being held in his home state, where hundreds have lined up to pay tribute to the 46-year-old man. France 24's Fanny Allard traveled to North Carolina, where she sat down with George's uncle, Roger. He told her how he wants to remember his nephew.
Say his name. George Floyd. Say his name. George Floyd.
George Floyd died in Minnesota, but it was here in the state of North Carolina that he was born, where the Floyd family has lived for generations. His uncle Roger still lives nearby. He agreed to speak to France 24, but in a quiet hotel room away from protests to protect his own family.
Just total disbelief to absorb that, and it was just so devastating. And as I was able to begin to watch the video, I had to turn away for a moment because I could not absorb it all. Just a good kid. Yeah, big heart. Big Floyd.
While still in shock, Roger Floyd, who was born when civil rights movements in the United States were gathering momentum, is hoping that the current unrest against police brutality will mark a turning point in the country's history.
We need to come together as a united front and demand change. And I think that we're in a posture now to make that happen. Every day going forward, I'm going to speak his name to someone, whether they really want to listen or not. I really am going to speak his name because I want George life to live.
A memorial service is being held in Fayetteville, George Floyd's native town, ahead of his funeral in Texas next week. This as tens of thousands continue their protests across the country, calling for action against racial and social injustice.
Here in France, large crowds gathered in several cities, including Paris, Marseille, and Bordeaux, as part of several Black Lives Matter protests. A separate gathering was held outside the U.S. Embassy in the French capital. Protests had been banned by police in Paris, but that did not stop more than 5,000 people from taking part in the two demonstrations. The Interior Ministry says more than 23,000 protesters assembled across the country. Well, as we've been seeing, the raw anger stemming from the killing of George Floyd continues to have consequences worldwide, with demonstrators holding dozens of protests in major cities across the globe. And many activists have used the opportunity to shine light on cases of police brutality in their own countries. Fraser Jackson has this report.
London, Sydney, Seoul, Tunis. The outrage over the death of George Floyd is global. Defying lockdown measures or foregoing government advice, still they came in their hundreds of thousands, calling for an end to police brutality and institutional racism. In London, tens of thousands amassed despite the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. Most protesters brought masks, and some were provided for those who didn't.
It's been our grandfather's fight, it's been our father's fight. We don't want it to be our children's fight, and that's why we want to make sure they're a part of this as well.
It was a similar situation in Melbourne, where protesters waved away safety concerns.
I'm doing everything I can to stay safe and to help others stay safe, but at the end of the day, there are bigger injustices happening than a virus.
Protesters also gathered in central Tokyo, and in neighbouring South Korea, dozens of people took part in a march through the capital. On Thursday, Germany passed a law forbidding public authorities from discriminating against anyone based on their gender, race, sexual orientation and more. Now, tens of thousands gathered in Berlin's Alexanderplatz, and the movement spread to smaller cities like Hamburg and Munich as well. All in all, well over a dozen protests were held outside of the US on Saturday. They serve as a reminder that the fight for equality for people of color is not just an American problem.
To the Middle East now. Beirut was also the site of protests today, but for different reasons. Hundreds packed the streets of Lebanon's capital to voice their anger at the government, how it handled the coronavirus pandemic, and the country's economic crisis. As some protesters trashed stores and clashed with security forces, others waved banners calling for better living conditions, early parliamentary elections, and tougher measures to fight corruption in the country. The Lebanese Red Cross says more than 40 people were injured in the protests. Our correspondent Leila Molana Allen is in Beirut. She has more on what protesters are demanding from the government.
Today is the first time in months, of course, because of the coronavirus pandemic, that we've seen big protests, and they really had called protesters for a day of rage to come back to the streets. And there were thousands of protesters down here in downtown Beirut today, many more than we've seen for many months. But what we've started to see is a division of opinion, because at the beginning of this protest movement, protesters felt they were very united over what they wanted. Now, of course, there's a severe economic crisis here. Some people think the government should tackle that first. Others are saying, no, the corruption is what has to be rooted out, and we need to get rid of these leaders. There were some political parties here today who are calling for new elections. They're not represented in the current government, and they're also calling for Hezbollah to disarm, which is why those Hezbollah supporters were so angry today. And then protesters elsewhere saying, no, not at all. Civil society doesn't want to have new elections until we have reform of the electoral law, because we don't believe that any different kind of parliamentary assembly is going to be elected unless the law of the way people are elected here is changed. So we're just going to get the same kind of government again, and they're still not going to properly represent us. So we really are seeing divisions, and that's why there was quite a lot of tension today, and perhaps why things descended into violence.
Residents of Turkey's 15 biggest cities were allowed outside this Saturday, the first weekend not on lockdown since early April. To save an already precarious economy, authorities had restricted people's movements only on weekends. Now, as the numbers of new cases and deaths from the coronavirus have fallen, restrictions are easing, but not without a few communication glitches. France 24's Shona Bhattacharya reports from Istanbul.
It's their first weekend out of the house in 2 months, and Istanbul residents are relishing their newfound freedom.
Kesinlikle çok mutluyuz. Öncelikle 2-3 aydır balık tutamadığımız için zaten üzgündük. Evde kalmak aslında Türk insanına göre değilmiş, bize göre değilmiş. Şu an dışarıdayız, daha mutluyuz. Yavaş yavaş bir aksilik olmazsa işlerimiz de başlayacak. Şu an pandemi yüzünden işten de ayrıldık.
The deconfinement announcement was chaotic and confusing. Late on Thursday, after midnight, the Interior Minister said there would be yet another lockdown this weekend. But just a few hours later, after Turks complained on social media, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan contradicted that order, saying he didn't have it in his heart to make people stay home.
Örnek ben. Mesela biz bu 2,5 ay içinde mesela biz de iş yapamadık fazla. Yani esnafların şeyiyle, baskısıyla haklı bir baskıydı ama şöyle bir şey, Sağlık Bakanlığı'nın da haklı tarafları vardı. Sağlık Bakanlığı sonuçta insanlar düşünüyor ama bir de ekonomi var. Bir de ekonomiyi dengelemek lazım.
A double win for the president. Not only is he showing compassion and magnanimity for his voters, he's also reminding his very popular interior minister that there's only one man in charge in Turkey. That's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
Finally, one of France's most prominent historic monuments is open once again. The Palace of Versailles, its gardens and more than 800 hectares of parkland began welcoming visitors this Saturday, albeit under strict safety measures. But tourism officials remain unsure as to when tourists and travelers will begin returning to France. Currently, the palace only expects a fifth of the 20,000 visitors it usually sees on peak days. France 24's Valérie Decamp was there for the grand reopening. She sent us this report.
Visitors can once again admire the Château de Versailles in all its glory. It's reopening after 82 days, and weekend tickets are already sold out. Just a lucky few, no more than 500 people, will be able to access the palace per hour. And once inside, masks are mandatory.
Je suis prêt à accepter ce genre de choses. Ça vaut la peine par rapport à tout ce qu'on voit de beau dans ce château.
Et à l'entrée, il y avait le distributeur de gel hydroalcoolique. Donc de mon côté, c'est vrai que c'est assez rassurant.
This is the iconic Hall of Mirrors. And in preparation for the big day, all the ornaments here were cleaned, including more than 200 mirrors for the first time in 13 years. Now, this room is usually filled with people, but now visitors can get a taste of what a private tour would feel like.
Il y a très peu de monde, donc on peut apprécier, ce qui n'est pas souvent le cas.
Avec ma compagne, nous habitons Versailles depuis 1 an et on n'a jamais eu l'occasion de venir. Il y avait toujours des queues interminables et une foule importante.
Là, on peut être parfaitement narcissique. On a tout le temps de se mirer dans les miroirs.
The reopening would not be complete without the gardens and the re-inauguration of the famous water fountains. But there is one thing missing today, and that is a large number of tourists, of foreign tourists you normally see here today. Out of the 8 million people that visit the Château de Versailles every year, 80% come from abroad.
That is your news for now. Stay tuned to France 24.